Burnt rubber and iodine choked the trauma bay, barely masking the heavy copper tang of a life ending. Looking up with skin the color of wet ash, the Marine whispered, "Leave it. I'm already gone." He was right. Medical logic entirely agreed, at least until she saw his left hand. Trauma Bay 4 always held a residual chill, an unshakable cold that seemed to radiate from the stainless steel fixtures and the scuffed linoleum floor. Nora pressed the heel of her gloved hand against her left eyelid, trying to rub away a persistent, irritating twitch. It was hour 11 of a 12-hour night shift at a crumbling regional hospital, the kind of hour where the coffee turns to acid in your stomach and your arches throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. The overhead fluorescent light flickered, emitting a low, insect-like buzz. Nora stared at a smudge of dried betadine on the edge of the supply cart. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that a full night's sleep could fix, but a deep, cellular exhaustion born from 6 years of watching broken people get rolled through double doors. She didn't feel like a healer anymore. She felt like a mechanic working on a chronically defective assembly line. The paramedic radio on the wall spat a burst of static, fracturing the quiet. "County General, this is Rescue 7. We are 3 minutes out. Priority 1 trauma. Male, mid-30s. Single vehicle rollover versus a concrete overpass. Extensive crush injuries. Blood pressure is 60 over palp, heart rate 145 and thready. Patient is conscious, but decompensating." Nora didn't sigh. She didn't have the energy for it. She just mechanically reached for the trauma shears, tested the pivot with her thumb, and snapped a fresh pair of night-trial gloves over her wrists. The snap was loud. Final. Dr. Keller, the attending physician, pushed through the glass doors, looking equally worn. His scrubs were wrinkled, and he carried a half-empty foam cup of lukewarm water. "Concrete overpass," Keller muttered, dropping the cup into a biohazard bin. "At 80 miles an hour, probably. Let's get the rapid infuser primed." Nora nodded, hooking the thick, clear tubing into the machine. The sheer physics of a high-speed collision meant the body inside the ambulance was likely a sack of gravel. The double doors crashed open. It was an assault on the senses. The smell hit first, a nauseating cocktail of ruptured engine coolant, raw gasoline, wet earth, and the distinct, heavy iron scent of massive blood loss. The paramedics were shouting over each other, the squeal of the gurney wheels acting as a frantic underscore to their voices. They hauled him onto the center table on a yellow backboard. His name, according to the bloody wallet they tossed onto the counter, was Ben. Ben was a disaster. His jeans were shredded, soaked through with dark, sticky sludge. The right side of his chest was scraped raw, embedded with tiny, glittering shards of tempered safety glass. But it was the sheer volume of blood pooling around his hips that caught Nora's eye. It was dripping off the sides of the backboard, splattering onto her clogs. "On 3!" Keller barked. 1, 2, 3! They slid him off the board. Ben didn't scream. He didn't thrash. Nora moved to his head, her scissors biting into the thick fabric of his jacket, slicing it away in long, brutal strips. The cold air of the room hit his bare skin, raising goosebumps on his pale arms. "Sir, stay with us," Nora said, her voice flat, practiced. It lacked warmth, but it carried authority. She shined a penlight into his eyes. His pupils were sluggish. Ben blinked, turning his head slowly toward her. His face was smeared with grease and mud, but his eyes were startlingly lucid. They weren't the panicked, darting eyes of a civilian who didn't understand what was happening. They were calculating, resigned. "Save the plastic, Doc," Ben rasped, his voice a low, wet gravel. Nora paused, the plastic housing of a large-bore IV needle in her hand. "Excuse me?" Ben took a shallow, rattling breath, his chest barely rising. I said, save the plastic. He swallowed hard. I did 2 tours in Helmand, infantry. I've seen this movie. My pelvis is crushed. I can feel the pool under my back. I'm bleeding out internally. Nora felt a flicker of annoyance cut through her exhaustion. She hated it when patients tried to self-diagnose, but she hated it even more when they were right. She forced the needle into a vein in his forearm, securing it with a strip of harsh white tape. Let us do our jobs, Ben. Just breathe. I know the math. Ben whispered, staring at the ceiling tiles. He wasn't looking at Nora anymore. He was looking through the ceiling, past the flickering light. Heart rate is maxed. Perfusion is gone. My toes are blocks of ice. It's too late. Keller moved in with the portable ultrasound machine, squeezing a dollop of cold blue gel onto Ben's rigid abdomen. The screen flickered to life. Nora watched Keller's jaw tighten. The physician pressed the wand harder into Ben's flank. The screen showed a massive, dark, irregular void where there shouldn't be one. Fluid. A lot of it. Massive retroperitoneal hemorrhage, Keller said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the tone doctors use when they are no longer speaking to the patient, but to the grim reaper standing over the bed. His pelvis is shattered. We can't stabilize it. He's dumping his entire blood volume into his abdominal cavity. Nora looked at the monitors. The red numbers of the blood pressure reading were flashing violently. 55/30. Ben let out a dry, humorless chuckle. A drop of blood bubbled at the corner of his lips. Told you. Fatal funnel. Get ortho and general surgery down here, Keller yelled to a tech outside the room, though there was no urgency in his stride. He looked at Nora. They shared a split-second glance. The unspoken language of the trauma bay. He's not going to make it to the elevator, let alone the operating table. Just... Ben coughed, a wet, terrible sound. Stop poking me, I'm cold, just let me ride it out. Nora stood there, the empty plastic wrapper of the IV needle crinkling in her grip. She looked down at this man, this former Marine who had clinically assessed his own demise and accepted it with a terrifying, stoic calm. It made her stomach turn. Not out of sorrow, she was too burnt out for sorrow, but out of a deep, uncomfortable recognition of his complete surrender. It mirrored her own cynicism entirely too well. The organized chaos of the trauma bay dissolved into a heavy, suffocating silence. It happened fast. Once the decision was made, once the surgical teams confirmed they couldn't cut fast enough to fix a shattered pelvis, pumping out blood like a broken mane, the momentum evaporated. The respiratory therapist quietly stepped back from the airway cart. The junior nurses filtered out, murmuring low excuses, moving on to the next disaster in the waiting room. They retreated to the safe, sterile harbor of the nurses' station, leaving the dying man in the care of the primary. Nora was the primary. She was left alone with Ben, the erratic beep of the heart monitor acting as a metronome for his final minutes. The room felt incredibly large now, cavernous and empty. Dr. Keller is making some calls to see if we can get your family on the line. Nora lied. Her voice was softer now, the sharp, authoritative edge sanded down by the inevitable. She knew there wasn't time for phone calls. Ben didn't open his eyes. No family, he breathed. Just my dog. Neighbor has him. Nora grabbed a package of warm saline wipes from the heated cabinet. It was a useless, palliative gesture, but it was all she had left. You can't stop the bleeding, but you can clean the mud off a man's face before he goes. It was the only part of her job that still felt vaguely human. She stepped up to the head of the gurney. The smell of copper was thick enough to taste. You're a good nurse, Ben murmured. His speech was slurring, the brain slowly starving of oxygen as his blood pressure plummeted to 40/20. I'm just doing my job, Ben. No, you didn't look away, he said, forcing his eyelids open. His irises were a pale, washed-out blue, striking against the dirt and grease. Most people look away when they know. Nora felt a strange, tight lump form in her throat. She swallowed it down violently. She didn't want to connect with him. Connection was dangerous. Connection meant taking this ghost home with her to her empty apartment. She peeled back the seal on the wipes. The steam rose in a faint wisp. She began to gently wipe the dried dirt from his forehead, working her way down to his jaw. His skin was freezing. The clinical term was diaphoretic and clammy, but to Nora's touch, it felt like marble left out in the winter rain. "It's getting dark," Ben whispered. His chest barely rose. Tell them to stop the alarm." He meant the monitor. It was screaming, a high-pitched, relentless warning that the heart was beating at 160 beats per minute, desperately trying to pump blood that simply wasn't there. "I'll turn it down," Nora said, stepping away to silence the machine. When she returned, she moved to clean his chest. The heavy, rigid plastic of the cervical collar was strapped tightly around his neck, biting into his skin. If he was dying anyway, there was no point in keeping him in a medieval torture device. "I'm going to loosen this collar, Ben, make you a bit more comfortable." She ripped the Velcro strap. The harsh scrut sound was jarring in the quiet room. She carefully opened the plastic clamshell, exposing his thick neck and the tops of his collarbones. She wiped away a thick smear of coagulated blood sitting in the hollow of his throat. And then she froze. Nora stopped breathing. Her hand, holding the blood-soaked wipe, hovered inches from his skin. She blinked hard, leaning in closer, the harsh glare of the overhead light casting sharp shadows across his anatomy. "That doesn't make sense," her tired brain whispered. She looked down at the floor. The pool of blood beneath his hips was massive, undeniably. But as she looked at the heavy canvas belt of his shredded jeans, she noticed the saturation pattern. The blood wasn't blooming upward from his pelvis. It was streaming downward. She snapped her gaze back to his neck. The right jugular vein, which should have been completely flat and empty in a man who had supposedly bled half his volume into his abdomen, was distended. It was bulging beneath the skin, thick as a garden hose, pulsing erratically. Nora dropped the wipe. It hit the floor with a wet smack. "Ben," she said, her voice entirely different now. It was sharp, electric. "Take a breath. Try to take a deep breath." Ben groaned, a weak sound of protest. "Can't. Chest is a rock." Nora's hands flew to his chest. Keller had assumed a crushed pelvis and a catastrophic abdominal bleed based on the ultrasound and the massive pool of blood. But the ultrasound merely showed fluid. It didn't prove the fluid was from a shattered pelvic artery. She placed her stethoscope against the left side of his chest. Nothing. Complete, terrifying silence. No air movement. Just the faint, distant thud of a failing heart. She moved the bell to the right side. Whoosh, whoosh. Air was moving, but it sounded strained, compressed. She looked at his trachea. It wasn't centered. It was subtly, distinctly pushed to the right side of his throat. A millimeter or two, hidden perfectly by the thick plastic of the cervical collar that Keller hadn't bothered to remove. Nora's cynical exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent spike of adrenaline. The mathematics of dying had been wrong. The variables were corrupted. It wasn't a pelvic bleed killing him. The blood pooling at his waist was from a superficial laceration on his flank, bleeding heavily but not fatally, pooling at the lowest point on the backboard. The real killer was in his chest. A broken rib from the steering wheel had punctured his left lung. The lung had collapsed, and with every ragged breath he took, air was trapped in the pleural space, building immense pressure. It was crushing his heart, kinking the superior vena cava, which explained the bulging neck vein, and completely preventing blood from returning to his heart. He wasn't bleeding to death. He was suffocating from the inside out, the pressure mimicking massive hemorrhagic shock, a tension pneumothorax. It was a rookie mistake for the team to miss it, masked by the sheer trauma of the crash and his own confident misdiagnosis. He's not bleeding out, Nora realized, her heart hammering against her ribs. His heart just can't refill. "Keller!" Nora screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet ER, shattering the somber atmosphere. She didn't wait for the doctor. There was no time. The monitor flashed 30 over 10. Ben's eyes were rolling back. She spun to the supply cart, ripping open the top drawer with such force it nearly came off its tracks. Her hands flew over the disorganized mess of plastic packaging, searching for a 14-gauge angiocath needle, the longest, thickest needle they had. "Hang on, Marine." Nora hissed through her teeth, finding the needle and ripping the plastic open with her teeth. She tasted blood and sterile paper. "You don't get to be right tonight." Nora's fingers moved by muscle memory, stripping away the clear plastic cap of the large needle. Her thumb found Ben's collarbone, slid down to the first rib, then the second. The space between the second and third ribs felt tight, stretched like the skin of a bloated basketball. She didn't have time to prep the skin with iodine or ask Keller for permission. "Nora, what are you doing?" Keller's voice boomed from the doorway, sharp with panic. He dropped his clipboard. The pen clattered across the linoleum floor. She ignored him. Leaning her weight into her right hand, she aimed the thick needle just over the top of the third rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle. The resistance of the skin was stubborn. Then a sudden, sickening pop echoed through the metal frame of the gurney as the needle pierced the parietal pleura. Immediately, a sharp hiss erupted from the hub. It sounded like a tire blowing out on the highway. A jet of hot, stagnant, metallic-smelling air sprayed directly into Nora's face, catching her hair and splashing microscopic droplets of old blood across her safety glasses. The stench of trapped, decaying breath and pressure filled the small space between them. The monitor reacted instantly. The frantic, high-pitched alarm slowed down, changing cadence from a terrified stutter to a heavy, rhythmic thump. The heart rate dropped from 160 to 110. The blood pressure digits on the screen jumped from 30 to 75 over 40. Ben's chest dropped with a sudden, massive deflation. He gasped, a long, ragged intake of oxygen that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface of a dark lake. His eyes snapped open, wide and bloodshot, fixed directly on Nora's face. He tried to pull away, but he didn't have the leverage. "Don't move!" Nora ordered, her voice shaking, despite her attempt at control. She slid the sharp metal stylet out of the plastic cannula, leaving the flimsy orange tube embedded in his chest to keep the vent open. Air continued to whistle through it, a low, steady exhale of pressure. Keller was at the bedside now, his hands hovering over the gurney, his face a pale mask of realization. He looked at the bulging jugular vein, which was already flattening out, disappearing back into the contours of Ben's neck. He looked at the orange plastic hub sticking out of the man's upper chest. "Tension," Keller whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The pelvic fluid, it was a red herring. It was just a superficial mesenteric bleed. The real volume was still in his vessels. "He was dying of pressure, Doctor," Nora said, her voice dropping into a flat, cold register. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a bitter, hollow ache in her joints. "Not volume. I missed it," Keller said. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked small. The collar hid the trachea. The jeans were soaked, I assumed. We all assumed. Nora said, reaching for a roll of silk tape to secure the temporary needle. "Get the chest tube tray. This plastic isn't going to hold forever. He needs a formal drain." Keller nodded quickly, almost gratefully, turning on his heel to sprint toward the sterile supply cabinets. He was glad to have a task, glad to escape the quiet judgment radiating from Nora's posture. Ben was looking at her, his breathing shallow but regular now. The grey tint on his lips was fading, replaced by a faint, bruised pink. "You," he whispered. "What did you do?" "I poked a hole in you," Nora said, her fingers working quickly to anchor the orange hub to his skin. "You had a pocket of air crushing your heart. I let it out." "Thought I was gone," he muttered. "You almost were," Nora said. She picked up a clean gauze pad and wiped a line of sweat from his eyebrow with the rough efficiency of a person who had 5 other patients waiting for pain meds in the hallway. "But you don't get the easy way out tonight, Marine. You still have to pay your taxes." He let out a weak laugh that turned into a grimace. "Damn it!" Keller returned with the blue plastic tray, the sterile instruments rattling inside. The tech followed him, eyes wide, sensing the shift in the room's temperature. The quiet room wasn't a morgue anymore. It was an active construction zone again. Nora stepped back, pulling off her soiled gloves and dropping them into the red biohazard bin. Her hands were trembling. She tucked them into her armpits to hide the movement from the tech, watching Keller prep the side of Ben's chest with brown iodine, watching the scalpel slice through skin to make way for the thick plastic chest tube. She felt absolutely nothing. No joy, no triumph, no heroic surge of pride. Just the heavy, leaden realization that the clock was still ticking and her shift wasn't over. By 5 in the morning, Trauma Bay 4 was empty again. The surgical team had taken Ben up to the operating room to clean out the glass from his side and fix the minor abdominal lacerations that had caused all the misdirection. He was stable. His blood pressure was sitting at a comfortable 110/70. He was going to live. Nora remained in the room, holding a spray bottle of disinfectant. The room smelled of bleach and surface cleaner. She wiped down the gurney, her arm moving in wide, lazy circles. The mechanical motion was comforting. It required no thought, no intuition, no split-second calculations that could cost a man his life. Her back was stiff. Every time she bent over to wipe the lower rails of the bed, a sharp pain shot through her lumbar spine. She was 34, but tonight she felt 70. The double-glass doors slid open, and Miller, the morning shift nurse, walked in carrying a fresh travel mug. She looked bright, clean, and horribly awake. "Hey, Nora, hear you had a wild one. The Marine?" "Yeah," Nora said quietly. "He's upstairs. Keller's out at the desk writing the note." Miller said, leaning against the counter. "He looks like he got hit by a truck. Said you pulled a rabbit out of a hat." "No rabbits," Nora muttered, tossing the dirty paper towels into the grey trash bin. "Just a plastic tube. The paperwork is on the desk. Don't touch the IV pump in bed 3. It's got a sticky button." She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want the praise, and she certainly didn't want Keller's sudden guilt-driven admiration. It made her skin crawl. If she had been 10 seconds slower, if she had been just a little more tired, she would have let Ben die, because the charts and the machines said he was supposed to. That wasn't heroic. It was terrifying. Nora walked down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the locker room. The fluorescent lights felt like needles behind her eyes. She changed out of her stained scrubs, pulling on a faded grey sweatshirt and a pair of worn-out jeans. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the sink. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes looking like bruised fingerprints. Her hair was a messy nest of static. She left the locker room and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. She told herself she was just delivering his bloody wallet to the ICU clerk, that it was standard protocol. But as she passed the double doors of the intensive care unit, her feet dragged. Ben was in bed 6. He was intubated now, a thick plastic breathing tube taped to his mouth, connected to a ventilator that clicked and whirred with a mechanical rhythm. He was heavily sedated, his face clean, his skin looking less like marble and more like living flesh. A clean white sheet was pulled up to his chest, hiding the thick plastic tube, draining clear fluid from his pleural cavity into a plastic box on the floor. Nora stood quietly at the glass partition, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her sweatshirt. A nurse she didn't know was adjusting the intravenous lines. Nora watched the woman's movements, careful, precise, detached. It was the same dance they all did. Suddenly, Ben's eyes fluttered open. The sedation was heavy, but something inside him seemed to fight through the chemical fog. He turned his head toward the glass. He couldn't speak through the plastic in his throat, but his eyes locked onto Nora. He didn't smile, he didn't wave. He just looked at her, his gaze steady, heavy with an unspoken understanding. He knew exactly what she had done, and he knew the cost of it. Nora gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was an agreement. A quiet contract between two people who had looked into the same dark hole and decided for one more day to stay on the edge. She turned and walked toward the elevators. The hospital lobby was quiet as she exited through the sliding glass doors. The morning air hit her like a physical slap, sharp, cold, and smelling faintly of damp asphalt and distant diesel exhaust. The sun was just beginning to crack over the horizon, painting the bottom of the grey clouds with a thin, dirty orange streak. She walked across the gravel parking lot to a 10-year-old sedan. Her keys jingled in her hand, a thin, metallic sound that felt small against the vast quiet of the dawn. She got in, turned the key, and listened to the engine groan before catching. She sat there for a long moment, her hands resting on the cold steering wheel. The engine vibrated through her palms. Her eyelid gave one final irritating twitch, then stopped. Nora pulled out of the parking lot, shifting into drive. She didn't feel like a savior. She didn't feel like she had changed the world. She just felt like a woman who had to go home, feed her cat, and sleep before the alarm went off again at 5. The world was still broken. The hospital would still be underfunded. The next ambulance would still arrive, but as she drove past the concrete overpass where Ben had hit the wall, she looked at the grey barrier. There was a long black streak of rubber on the concrete, a physical scar of the speed and the violence of the night. It was just a mark on a wall. But the man who made it was still breathing. That had to be enough. It was the only thing that could be enough. If Nora's raw, unflinching story touched your heart, remember that heroes wear scrubs and fight silent battles every single day. True medical drama isn't about perfect miracles. It's about the grit, the exhaustion, and the quiet details that save a life when everyone else has given up hope. Don't let this powerful story fade into the background. Please hit that like button right now, share this video with someone who needs it, and subscribe today for more deeply grounded human stories.